Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for Dementia 101, the webinar. My name is Lucy Gerland, and I am a caregiver specialist with the Fairfax Area Agency on Aging. So we have a really great speaker today, and I'll tell you more about her. I'll tell you a lot about her in a moment. I want you to know that all attendees are in listen-only mode, but you can ask questions. On your dashboard, you have a bar that says questions, and you just need to open that up and type in your question. Most of the questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. So about 12:45, I'll start to relay your questions to our speaker. The webinar is being recorded, and I will send out a link to the recorded webinar to everyone who is registered. The speaker's slides were sent out this morning for your reference. And so now I am excited to introduce today's speaker, Lindsay Vajpayee. Lindsay is currently the Director of Education and Outreach at Insight Memory Care Center. Lindsay has dedicated her career to working with older adults who live with dementia and their caregivers. She enjoyed her time as an activity director in long-term care for nearly a decade, and she also served as programs and services manager for the Alzheimer's Association. Lindsay currently holds an activity director certification, Essentials Dementia Advanced Care certification, and a master trainer certification with the Best Friends approach to dementia care. Lindsay is truly passionate about quality dementia care from professionals, support and education for care partners, and assisting those with dementia to retain a sense of self and purpose throughout every stage of the disease. I personally have been very fortunate to get to work with Lindsay several times, and I will turn this over to her now. Lindsay, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Lucy, and hello to everyone out there watching the webinar. I'm really glad to be here and to just share some really important information with you that I hope you find meaningful as well. And please do write your comments, your questions in the chat box, and we'll address those towards the end of the program. So here we go, Dementia 101. So let's start off by talking about what is normal with the aging process. You know, people think about senior moments. Sometimes there's a misconception about the word dementia, that it's something normal that happens with age, when it's really not. But here are some of the things that are normal as we age. Maybe you walk into a room, you walk into the kitchen, and you forget what you went in there for, but maybe a minute later you remember. You lose things from time to time. You forget about an appointment, but you remember later. You make a bad decision once in a while, you know, or other things that just take a little bit longer to retrieve from our memory. For example, if you're trying to think of the address of the home you lived in 3 houses ago, you know, things like that just take a little bit more time to retrieve. And that's normal as we age. We can expect that to happen, you know, to all of us to some degree. But then there's dementia, and dementia is not a normal part of the aging process. Dementia means there is a cognitive impairment that's severe enough to interfere with daily functioning. It's not just a little bit annoying, it's not just a little bit irritating, it's really something that starts to get in the way of daily life. It affects a person's thinking abilities, it affects their language, social abilities, and lots of other things that our brain controls, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it is something that's not a normal part of the aging process. It is, however, more common for people who are older. So that's why we think of dementia as being, you know, sort of a set of diseases that are part of older age. Dementia itself is not a specific disease. It's just a general term that we use to describe a general set of symptoms. So here I've got sort of a visualization to help you understand what I mean when I say that dementia is just a general term. We can think of the word dementia as being this umbrella. It's an umbrella term that just gives us some idea about what's happening to a person. Now, what you see on your screen on the left are a set of irreversible forms of dementia. These are the things you probably usually think of when you think about the word dementia. And we're going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. But things like Alzheimer's disease, vascular dementia, dementia with Lewy bodies, frontotemporal degeneration, Parkinson's disease dementia, and there's actually over 100 different types of dementia. And then on the right, you see a number of reversible causes for a set of symptoms that look like dementia. If someone has an infection, particularly an older person who might have a urinary tract infection, have pneumonia, an upper respiratory infection, that can look like dementia. It can affect a person's thinking abilities until it's treated. Depression, tumors, metabolic disorders, medications, whether that means they've been taken improperly or it's maybe a strong pain medication or a side effect. Maybe it's a vitamin deficiency, alcohol use, or lots of other things that might give you some of those dementia-like symptoms, but it's actually due to something that can be treated or reversed. So what are some of those warning signs of those things that aren't normal? We talked about things like walking into the kitchen, forgetting what you went in there for, remembering a few minutes later. That's normal. But then we have this set of kind of warning signs, things that are crossing over from normal into something that maybe we should be concerned about. So one of those early warning signs for many people that are experiencing some form of dementia is memory loss that disrupts daily life. So not just forgetting to pick up a gallon of milk on the way home, but really forgetting things that start to interfere with life, forgetting about really important information that someone told you, important conversations. It really starts to become a pattern from day to day of just forgetting things, and it starts to get in the way of how we live. Another warning sign is challenges in planning or solving problems. So being able to sequence, to think about, I need to do this before I can do that, and then I'll do the next thing, or being able to solve a problem if one arises. The third warning sign is difficulty completing familiar tasks. So things that we do kind of on a day-to-day basis that normally don't take us a whole lot of effort. So think about things like using the microwave, using the telephone, the remote control, getting dressed in the morning, paying bills, driving to familiar places, tying your shoes. These kind of regular daily tasks might start to become more challenging. They may start to take longer to complete or be done with less quality. The next warning sign would be confusion with time or place. So maybe getting days and nights mixed up, losing the passage of time, not really understanding if something is going to happen tomorrow or a month from now or a year from now, not being able to distinguish what those kind of the passage of time means. Or confusion with place, becoming very disoriented in new places, unaware of maybe where you are, how you got there, how to get, back home. And the next warning sign is trouble with visual images and spatial relationships. So that means even if your eyes can physically see something, your brain isn't quite making sense of that information. So one of the ways that you might see this in a person living with dementia is they have some difficulty with depth perception. So when you get to, for example, a set of stairs, not recognizing that you'll need to adjust your step so that you don't fall down the stairs, or you might need to take a step up to start going up the stairs. You might also notice issues with color contrast. If two things are nearly the same color, it's hard for that person's brain to distinguish those surfaces. For example, if the chair and the floor are a similar color, that person may have some difficulty sitting down squarely in the chair. Another warning sign, new problems with words in speaking or writing. So having some difficulty with language, having difficulty thinking of the word that you want to say, articulating yourself, writing things down, being able to read and understand written text. Another warning sign, misplacing things and losing the ability to retrace steps. So it's not really the losing things that's a big problem. I mean, we all do that from time to time, but it's an issue when we can't retrace our steps. If I lose my purse, if I can't find it in the morning when it's time to come to work, I'm going to kind of walk backwards in my mind and think about where my purse might be. Did I leave it in the kitchen? Did I leave it in the car? Where might it be? And I'll probably find it. For someone who's experiencing dementia, they're going to have a lot more difficulty with something like that. Or they may put things in unusual places, maybe put my purse in the freezer, things that just don't quite make sense to the rest of us. The next warning sign is decreased or poor judgment. So really when we're starting to make decisions that are not using good judgment, you could think about things like money management being one of those first things that might start to change for a person with early memory loss. Not using good judgment on how to spend money, how much money is a service worth or a product worth, falling victim to scams. Judgment also comes into play with things like driving. Should I have my headlights on? Which direction should I go down the road? How fast should I go? All of those sorts of tasks rely on us having good judgment. The next warning sign, withdrawal from work or social activities. So pulling back from the things that that person used to do, whether it's taking on less assignments at work, backing out of volunteer responsibilities, turning down invitations to go to family events or out to dinner with friends, just kind of pulling back from the things that person used to do. And the last warning sign is changes in mood and personality. So that might mean becoming more irritable, more anxious, more fearful, just kind of changes from that person's normal mood and personality. Now, with any of these one warning signs, there could be lots of reasons that that might be. Maybe that person isn't remembering information that someone recently told them, but maybe they have a hearing problem and they really didn't even hear it. So of course, then they can't remember it. Or maybe there is a change in mood, but that person is experiencing grief. They've experienced a big transition of some kind. And for every other warning sign, there might be other reasons that someone would experience that. But when we're looking to someone that we know and love, and we see that there's a change, and we can't quite pinpoint why that might be, it could be because there's some form of dementia. So before we actually even get into dementia, let's address this term, mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. Mild cognitive impairment means there is a cognitive impairment that is severe enough to show up on testing and maybe be noticeable to other people in our lives, but not severe enough to really start to get in the way of daily activities. So maybe there's just a problem in kind of one area of our brain, but it's not severe, it's not significant yet. This is not a type of dementia because it's not actually really interfering with daily life. If someone has mild cognitive impairment, it's possible that it might stay the same indefinitely or possibly improve, but for many people, this is increasing their risk for eventually being diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia. Now, the most common form of dementia is Alzheimer's disease. So one of the most common questions that I get is, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's? You tend to hear those terms used interchangeably so often. Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. So if someone has Alzheimer's, they do have dementia. If someone has been diagnosed with dementia, it's a very general diagnosis. It could be Alzheimer's, it could be vascular dementia, it could be a number of different forms of dementia. So Alzheimer's is an irreversible, progressive brain disorder. So that means it's going to continue getting worse over time. It causes problems with memory, thinking, behavior, and lots of other areas that our brain controls in our lives. But the first warning sign for most people is memory, those short-term memory problems. That person being able to tell you at length about things that happened in childhood, teenage years, early on in their career, but really struggling with those things that happened most recently. Did I take my medications this morning? Did my family member come and visit me yesterday? Forgetting important things that someone told them or about appointments coming up. So these are some of the things that we might see with Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's does account for about 60 to 80% of dementia cases, and about 5.7 million Americans have Alzheimer's disease. Most people are over the age of 65. Basically, the older you get, the more at risk you become. However, there are about 200,000 people who have younger onset Alzheimer's, which means they were diagnosed before the age of 65. Sometimes that has a stronger familial component, but sometimes it's still sporadic. There's really no way to stop or slow the disease, but there are some treatments available for symptoms. So there are medications that you may have heard of. Some of the brand names would be Aricept, Razidine, Exelon, Namenda. These are FDA-approved medications that help the brain function better for a while for some of the people that take it. They don't actually slow down the disease process, They don't cure the disease, but they can be helpful for some people for a period of time. So one of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease you may have heard of would be the plaques and the tangles. So plaques are these deposits of a protein fragment called beta amyloid that build up in the spaces between nerve cells. So if you look over at the image on the right side of your screen, you can see those kind of dark brown spots in that little blow up box that shows some amyloid plaques. Where if you look at the box on the left side of the brain there, you don't see those plaques built up. The tangles are twisted fibers of another protein called tau that build up inside the cells. So one thing with Alzheimer's disease, that research has really been working on, but not come up with a totally conclusive answer, is do the plaques and tangles form and that causes the cell death? Or is something else happening in the brain? The cells are dying and then the plaques and tangles are developing. Research is still trying to sort that out, but you'll see that a lot of research is targeting especially the beta amyloid and also some of the tau when they're looking at different sorts of treatments for the future. Really, research looks mostly at those who are either not yet diagnosed or are in the early stage and trying different kinds of treatments that will hopefully slow down or stop the progression of the disease. But so there's a lot happening with research, and we'll talk a tad bit more about that at the end of the program. For Alzheimer's disease, there are some known risk factors. Like I said, the older you get, the more at risk you become. Age is really the primary risk factor for Alzheimer's. Family history and genetics also plays a role. Now, there are some risk genes that may be carried down from family member to family member. The most kind of well-known is called ApoE4. And if you receive copies of these genes from your parents, it increases your risk, but it doesn't mean that you'll for sure develop Alzheimer's disease. There are also deterministic genes, and these are very rare. There's just a few hundred families worldwide that have these deterministic genes, where if you receive this sort of genetic mutation, you are very, very likely, nearly 100% likely to develop Alzheimer's disease in the future, and usually at very young ages. So most families, it's possible that you have risk genes. For most families, you probably don't have these deterministic genes unless you've seen a lot of people in your family have Alzheimer's disease at very young ages, like in your 30s and 40s, multiple family members. But family history does play a role in our risk, so it's good to know. A head injury also plays a role. If someone has had a traumatic brain injury in their lifetime, a series of concussions, that increases risk for Alzheimer's disease as well. There are some other suspected risk factors. Research shows some relationship, but is still trying to get to the point of saying, this causes that. So some suspected risk factors, heart disease and high blood pressure, are some of the things that seem like there's a relationship. Diabetes, depression, and other lifestyle factors, such as lack of physical activity. Those who have a lower level of education seem to be more at risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. And there's a few things that aren't listed on this screen, but might be important to know. Women are more at risk of developing Alzheimer's than men. And also African Americans are twice as likely as older whites to develop Alzheimer's, and Latinos are 1.5 times as likely as older whites to develop Alzheimer's. So there are a number of things that seem to be at play, which really makes research difficult when it seems like there's not just one thing to look at. It's not just genetics. It's not just lifestyle. It's not just age or race or gender. It's really sort of a combination of these factors. All right, just waiting for my screen to click forward. My computer might be a little frozen. Okay, so stages. We think about dementia and as kind of happening in stages. It doesn't mean that someone would just wake up one day in the late stage of the disease, sort of a continuum. So you see the arrow at the bottom. It's just something that slowly happens over time. But just for ease of kind of understanding the disease, we tend to talk about it as early, middle, and late stage. So in the early stage, we tend to see especially short-term memory loss, getting lost in familiar places, misplacing objects, and having some difficulty with complex tasks or situations. So think about things like paying the bills, making really big complicated decisions, or navigating a complex social situation, like maybe a dinner party. In the middle stage of the disease, we tend to see increased confusion, really much more noticeable, where someone in the early stage might be able to kind of mask some of that confusion, kind of laugh it off, can compensate for the things that they're not remembering. By the middle stage, we start to, it's really much more noticeable confusion, much more noticeable poor judgment, especially with things like hygiene, safety issues, to a much more extensive degree. You see more communication challenges in the middle stage of the disease, people less able to articulate something that they need or they want, vocabulary becoming, just a little bit more simple, starting to speak in more phrases rather than extended conversations. And in the middle stage, you start to see that people usually need more assistance with those personal care tasks, activities of daily living, like getting dressed, like brushing teeth, brushing hair, showering, using the bathroom, things like that. And then in the late stage of the disease, as the disease continues to progress, we really see additional changes, that person's memory being even more impaired. It's like that person is kind of going backwards in time. They may think that they have young children at home. They may ask for their parents who've been long gone. We certainly see more loss of ability to communicate, where that person's vocabulary might be reduced to just a few words. It might just be sounds. It might be sort of nonverbal signals. Certainly there's a loss of physical capabilities, really a need for full-time care to help with all activities of daily living. And so, of course, like I said, this doesn't just happen overnight. This is just sort of a continuum. And how quickly does the disease progress really varies from person to person. Average life expectancy for someone with Alzheimer's, once the diagnosis is made, average is 8 years, but really the range of what is possible is huge. It could be a few years up to more than 20 years. So it really does vary from person to person. And now we're going to move on to talk about vascular dementia. So vascular dementia is a different type of dementia that occurs because of brain injuries, like microscopic bleeding or blood vessel blockages. So think about mini strokes, for example, kind of all of these small strokes blocking blood flow in the brain and eventually having cell death as a result. So the location, the number, the size of the brain injury really determines how that individual is affected. How is their thinking affected, their physical functioning, what part of the brain was affected and how severely. So one of the differences that you tend to see with Alzheimer's and vascular dementia, Alzheimer's just kind of has a gradual deterioration over time. Where vascular dementia, you tend to see the progression more in a stepwise pattern. So whenever there's a vascular incident of some kind, then it's, there's sort of a deterioration. And then that person might stay kind of right where they are for a while till there's another incident. And now we see another step down. Another type of dementia is called Lewy body dementia. And Lewy body dementia is kind of its own little mini umbrella that represents two different types of dementia. Dementia with Lewy bodies and Parkinson's disease dementia. So Lewy bodies are these abnormal clumps of a protein that accumulate in neurons, typically found in the brain cortex. The first signs of dementia with Lewy bodies are often those deficits in attention and executive functioning. We tend to see big fluctuations in cognitive abilities. Maybe, for these 10 minutes, it seems like this person is fairly normal, lucid, everything's going on along okay. And then maybe just a short time later, this person seems very suddenly disoriented, confused, paranoid, just really big changes. With dementia with Lewy bodies, we tend to see visual hallucinations, although it's not only visual hallucinations, it could be auditory hallucinations or other types as well. But visual hallucinations are very, very common with dementia with Lewy bodies. And then you also see these spontaneous features of Parkinsonism. So where dementia with Lewy bodies affects the brain is pretty much right next door to where Parkinson's disease affects the brain. So for both of these conditions, as they progress, they start to kind of overlap and look a little bit more like each other. So dementia with Lewy bodies, you tend to have the cognitive changes first, followed by movement issues later on. And with Parkinson's disease dementia, you tend to have the movement issues first for many years before there are cognitive changes. And about 80% of people with Parkinson's disease will develop the dementia component later on. Another form of dementia is frontotemporal degeneration, or you may hear it called FTD or frontotemporal dementia. And this is also sort of a group of brain disorders, its own kind of mini umbrella under the dementia umbrella. So you see a few of them listed here on your screen. Behavior variant frontotemporal degeneration, Pick's disease, PPA. There's actually a number of different types of FTD, but they tend to be issues in the temporal and or frontal lobes of the brain. They tend to be issues that the symptoms you see are either behavioral changes or language changes, not so much memory loss early on. So that's kind of one of the big things that a physician might look at. What are those early symptoms? So again, this is a kind of gradual progressive decline over time. FTD tends to affect men more often than women, and it tends to have a little bit younger onset than something like Alzheimer's disease. FTD typically has onset in a person's 50s and 60s, though it could be earlier or later than that. And so, each form of dementia does look a little bit different. The signs and symptoms might be different. The way it progresses might look a little bit different. But these are all neurodegenerative conditions. They are all progressive diseases. So what do you do if you notice some of these warning signs in one of your loved ones or in yourself? The first thing to do is to really see the doctor, to go see your primary healthcare provider, who's going to kind of run through some of those basic tests. They're going to look at your medications, see if there's anything going on there. They'll do maybe a mini mental status examination, sort of a really short cognitive screening tool. They'll screen for depression, anxiety. They'll look at your blood pressure. They're going to, look at lots of different things to see what's going on. And your primary healthcare provider might be able to diagnose something like Alzheimer's disease or another form of dementia if they're skilled in that area, if they have a lot of experience in that area, or they may refer on to a specialist, like a neurologist, a neuropsychologist, a geriatrician, someone else who probably has more experience working with these sorts of conditions, with older bodies and that sort of thing. And then those specialists are going to work through a number of other sorts of tests. They might ask for MRIs or PET scans or CT scans, different ways that they can look at the brain and try to get some understanding about what might be happening. For dementia, really you're trying to rule out other causes. So when someone is early stage, if they're not yet diagnosed, you usually can't look at just a brain scan and know what form of dementia someone has. Or you can't just do one cognitive test and know what form of dementia someone has. These are, we have to exclude all the other causes. It's not a brain tumor, it's not depression, it's not stroke, it's not, medication, it's not this, it's not that. And eventually, with all of the different sorts of tests, it's like putting pieces of a puzzle together. And then while all of this is happening, that provider is watching the continued change of that person living, with possible dementia. And they're watching to see if things continue to change over time. And they're putting all that information together to eventually give some sort of a diagnosis. So a family member, cannot make a diagnosis. I can't diagnose anyone. It's really, has to be a healthcare provider who can go through this entire process. And so, like I said, there are some treatments available to help with symptoms. And depending on the type of dementia, those treatments might be a little bit different. So that's, one reason that I really encourage family members to advocate with their doctors to get a specific diagnosis. Not just to say that mom has dementia, but what form of dementia does mom have? Because the treatments might be different. There are just particular things to know about each form of dementia. For example, if someone has Lewy body dementia, there are some medications that you absolutely do not want to take because they'll have a paradoxical reaction. So it's important to know what's going on so that the right course of treatment can be chosen, and for the right stage of dementia as well. The medications I mentioned earlier, some of them are more useful in the early to middle stage of the disease, some middle to late, and so it's important to make sure that the right treatment is being had. So what can you do? I mean, there are a number of things that you can do if you are a loved one of a person living with dementia, and I would start by educating yourself. The more you know, the more helpful you can be, the more prepared you can be, and there are a number of ways you can educate yourself. pat yourself on the back for getting on this webinar today. This is a really great first step if this is your first kind of reach out for education. You can find lots of webinars online through a number of different organizations. As you're probably aware, Fairfax County has a webinar each month, so you can look ahead to see what's coming up in the future and register for those classes. At Insight Memory Care Center here in Fairfax, Virginia, we have classes at least on a monthly basis, sometimes 2 or 3 a month. We also teach out in the community, and so there's lots of opportunities there. You can look to your local senior centers, community centers, libraries, assisted living communities will often have education classes open to the public, and so there's some other places as well. You can also find lots of information online, just by going into your internet browser and searching different kinds of terms. I would caution that you sort of be careful about what websites you're looking at. I would look to those, .gov websites for some reliable information. Look to credible medical institutions, like Mayo Clinic, for example, to have some good quality information. Another step would be to find support. Who is your support person? Because if someone has dementia, this is not a sprint, this is a marathon. This is something that we can all kind of grin and bear it and get through something for a short period of time, but when this is a long-term care situation, you need to have a team of support. So that may be friends, family members, faith communities, but that might also mean finding a support group. There are so many different options of support groups just here in the Northern Virginia area, some that meet in, during the day, in the evening, on the weekend, over the phone, online, lots of different options. And I would suggest trying different support groups until you find the one that really works for you. Each group is going to have its own kind of personality, depending on the venue, the facilitator's personality, the people who come to the group, if it's a large group, small group, all kinds of differences. So, really look out there and see what's available. Fairfax County has a Tuesday evening support group once a month. At Insight, we have 4 different support groups, and including one for Lewy body dementia caregivers, another for frontotemporal degeneration caregivers, and another for early stage caregivers. So some kind of little particular areas where you might find a group of peers that you don't find at a general support group elsewhere. Also, getting involved in a clinical trial is a really great thing to do. You can find all kinds of clinical trials at clinicaltrials.gov and search by location, by disease, by age, by lots of different criteria. When someone is involved in a clinical trial, it really gives them access to providers who are the best of the best, people who really know the disease inside and out, know treatments, know about promising research, maybe know about resources to help. There are lots of great institutions here locally that do clinical trials. It is, maybe an extra effort going in for those visits every so often, answering questionnaires, maybe it's giving blood or taking a medication, but it is really useful for the person living with dementia, for family to have that extra network of support, and it's important for the future to hopefully be able to, cure these diseases or at least stop them in their tracks, slow them down, come up with useful treatments. So even if it's not helping the individual who's involved, it's helpful for future generations. And I would also say, learn about community resources and reach out for help. Find what's out there. What can I tap into? So calling, Fairfax Area Agency on Aging to learn about resources through the county or other things that they're aware of. Calling Insight to learn about the things that we know of, looking online, contacting, all the different associations, the Alzheimer's Association, Alzheimer's Foundation of America, Lewy Body Dementia Association, FTD Association. There's all kinds of resources out there. So really seeing what's available. Respite care can be really helpful where you can get a break. So looking into those kinds of options, and just really reaching out, starting somewhere. Those who work in this, kind of industry are really interested in helping families and getting you connected to the things that are going to help you. So just kind of get started, and the ball will start rolling from there. So here are a list of some resources that might be useful for you. Insight Memory Care Center here in Fairfax. We offer classes, support groups, consultations. There's no charge for any of that. We do also have an adult day center and some early stage programs and couples programs for couples and other things as well. So you can find that on our website or by calling. Fairfax County Area Agency on Aging has also lots of great resources, including classes that they do in the community, support groups, respite programs, which I definitely would encourage you to check into if you haven't already, and lots of other resources. And so you see their website and phone number there. The Alzheimer's Association, of course, is a national association with local chapters nearby. So their website has lots of great tools. Their 1-800 number that's listed there on the screen is available 24/7. So if it's 2 a.m. and you have a burning question, you have a need, you know there's something going on, you can always call there and get some help. And then the National Institutes of Health. So you can find lots of useful information on their websites. By calling them, they will mail you information for free. They'll mail you booklets and brochures and all kinds of things, and also their clinicaltrials.gov website. So this is just a little bit about Insight, which I will pass by, and I sped right through the material. So now we have time for questions. So Lucy, you can let us know if you have anyone on the line with a question. And while you're reading through those, I do want to also mention when it comes to education that Lucy and I and many others work as part of the Northern Virginia Dementia Care Consortium, and we put together a caregiver conference every year in November. So the conference this year will be on Monday, November 12th. It's usually on Veterans Day or Veterans Day Observed, which is November 12th this year. It's going to be held in Alexandria. It's a full day conference, and the invitations aren't quite ready to be sent out yet, but they'll be available. The Eventbrite page will be available later on in August. And so if you have questions about that conference, feel free to contact myself or Lucy, and we can make sure you get that information when the Eventbrite page goes live. But that's just a really great resource to tap into. So Lucy, do we have any questions?
Yes, and Lindsay, thank you so much. That was really a lot of information packed into a very short period of time, but it was very thorough and understandable. And thanks for mentioning the conference. And yes, if you get either our e-newsletter, the Caregiver Corner Online, or the Insight Memory Care e-newsletter, you will see the invitation for the conference that Lindsay mentioned on Veterans Day, also at the Insight Memory Care Center homepage. And these things are really good. These e-newsletters and the Insight Memory Care homepage are really good ways to keep up with events that are happening in this area. And of course, in the case of a webinar, it doesn't really matter where you are. As long as you know that there's a webinar, you can patch on into it. So thanks again, Lindsay. And I will remind everybody, if you do have any questions, you can type them into the question box. So a question that I got, it was interesting because as you were speaking and I read a question and I thought, okay, she just answered that, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So sorry if it's a duplication. Early on, our doctor wanted my mom to get an MRI to determine if it was Alzheimer's or some other type of dementia. Does this really matter? Would an MRI be helpful?
An MRI is just kind of one piece of the puzzle. So it can be helpful. It can help rule out other conditions, or it's possible that there will be enough change that, a skilled person reading that MRI would be able to see that we think maybe this, is something not quite normal for this person's age. But an MRI alone is not useful enough for a diagnosis. It's an MRI with all kinds of other testing that really help that provider get to the decision point of we think this is Alzheimer's disease or something else.
And as you mentioned, there are differing treatments based on those things.
And if I can add too, with clinical trials, you have access to all kinds of tools like MRIs and specialty types of PET scans, like an amyloid PET scan, depending on the trial that you're part of, that would be possibly very costly in the clinic setting or not even available. These amyloid PET scans aren't available in our local hospitals and clinics. This is something that's still part of research. So you may have access to different kinds of tools to help get to a correct diagnosis that you might not have access to in your regular doctor's office.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I guess also you also want to weigh the benefits versus the what you're putting somebody through to get that.
Right.
Because an
So
MRI is, go ahead.
absolutely. And there are some people who can't have an MRI, if you have a pacemaker, things like that. But it is true, so a doctor may make a dementia diagnosis. And if it's someone who is in frail health, is in very advanced age, has complex medical situation, it's true you may not want to go through all of the testing to get to the specific diagnosis. Is it Alzheimer's? Is it Lewy body? Something else? But if there's not some reason to not go through the testing, it is useful to be able to provide the right sorts of treatments and to, provide the best care possible.
Okay. Should I go along with incorrect statements or should I correct them?
Oh, great question. The short answer is go along with it. Don't correct, don't argue, don't criticize. It's really not going to do you much good. It's going to make the other person probably upset, defensive, feel like they can't trust you, maybe feel, stupid or something. But for you too, it's going to be a waste of energy. You're now correcting and probably arguing with someone who's just not capable of reasoning things out the way that you are. So when somebody says something that's not correct, if it's not critical information in the moment, I would just go along with it. It's just fine. Maybe you're having dinner with someone else, just wink at that other person across the table, so they know maybe there's a little something off in this story, but no need to bring that to the surface right in front of the person.
Okay.
And if I can also add one more thing I like to share with caregivers, I would say take the phrase, "don't you remember," out of your vocabulary entirely. There's almost never a good time to say "don't you remember," because that means we're expecting someone who has impaired memory to remember something, and we're putting it right out there in the open if they don't remember. So rather than saying "don't you remember we went to the grocery store yesterday," you might say, "well, when we went to the store yesterday, I picked up this and this," rather than expecting that person to remember.
That's such an important point. I had that issue with aides that would always want to quiz my loved one, and they would say, what is your birthday and what are your children's names? And as the dementia progressed, it was more and more painful. I would always tell them, just tell her what our names are. Don't be quizzing her all the time.
Mhm.
So you need to watch out not just in yourself, but for people who are interacting.
Mm-hmm. And I think
Same.
sometimes families, if it's a family member doing sort of the quizzing, they're doing it maybe with good intentions. They want their loved one to remember all of the kids' names, but it's not going to be useful in that way, for most people, especially beyond the early stage. It's going to put them on the spot. It's going to make them feel bad. It's just really not going to accomplish the goal that the person is set out to do.
Right. Okay. And I have another question. Will a person's personality traits stay the same or are they likely to change?
So that really varies from person to person. I would say quite often I see um, whatever that person's personality was become amplified. So if it was someone who was always a bit reserved, they may become even more reserved, or someone who was always maybe quick to anger, they're even more, quick to anger. But I've also seen people do the exact opposite. Maybe someone who was very sort of docile, very polite their whole lives, that are now swearing like a sailor and, doing things they wouldn't normally do. And I've also seen people who have been kind of very stoic and very kind of grouchy throughout their lives become extremely loving and affectionate. So it really varies from person to person. But I would expect that there's some personality change, whether it's more of what used to be or something that's different from what used to be.
Okay. In reference to a recent comment, what is considered a very advanced age? My dad was recently diagnosed with general dementia. I'm trying to see if there's more to this question here. Just give me 1 second. That's all I see here.
Mm-hmm. So really what I'm getting at is, if someone is like my grandmother will be 100 in September. So does it make sense for her to travel and do all of the testing necessary to, if she already has dementia, but if she were only now developing it, maybe that doesn't make sense for her. And she's also in not great health for other reasons. But if someone is capable of going out for the testing, they're early enough in the disease process to be able to participate in the testing. If someone's middle stage, maybe they're not going to lay in an MRI machine and it's just not going to work out. But if it's someone early on in the disease and there's not reasons to not move forward with the testing, it's a good idea to know kind of what you're dealing with.
Okay. Can you please tell us other common phrases we should avoid? It was helpful to hear to avoid "don't you remember."
Yeah, okay, what else? Don't you remember? Yeah, definitely don't say that. I mean, just generally, I would say not to argue or challenge a person. One thing that might be helpful to think about is joining that person's reality. So if they think that they have young children to go pick up from school, I would not get into an argument about, well, your children are in their 50s and they have grandchildren of their own. I would just try to get into my loved one's world, try to understand the world from their perspective and how can I help them through this situation. Maybe there's a need that needs to be met. Maybe it's physical, maybe it's emotional. How can I get into their reality? I also would suggest just modifying communication. So simplifying the things that you say, not telling stories with great amounts of detail, not giving instructions that have multiple steps, just simplifying a little bit, speaking clearly, using nonverbal signals to support what you're saying verbally. So as a person's brain is changing with dementia, they're less and less able to understand the words that we say, and not, let alone retain, whatever instruction that you've given or question that you've asked. But people are looking more and more to our nonverbal signals to supplement that message. So am I smiling? Am I frowning? Are my arms crossed? There are things I can do to help my loved one. If I'm asking them to sit down, I could walk over to the chair and pat on the seat, come, let's sit down. Finding ways, maybe you point, maybe you walk the person to the bathroom and stay, instead of saying, well, go out the door and take a left and it'll be your first door on the right. That's just too much. So really just kind of simplifying the way you communicate with your loved one, and respecting and honoring the person who's there. Really, how can I connect with that person and their sense of self? What are the things that were really important to my loved one and how can I tap into that? So maybe we're not going to talk about what's going on with the grandkids and their soccer games and this and that. Maybe when I go and visit my loved one, we're going to talk about growing up on the farm. And did you work outside with your brothers? Did you stay inside with your sisters? Really kind of looking back and reminiscing and talking about things that are meaningful and enjoyable to that person.
Thank you. For a person with late-stage LBD and Parkinson's, what do they think? Do they realize their limitations? Are they bored sitting around all day? What is their life expectation?
Mm-hmm. I would say for people who have late-stage dementia of any kind, at that point, for most people, there's really no awareness that they have dementia, that that's going on. For someone in the early stage of the disease, Some people have an awareness, they recognize the changes that are taking place, maybe they know about the diagnosis, maybe others are in denial, but by late stage, that person really doesn't have an awareness of that diagnosis. And so you do see some changes throughout the stages that we hadn't talked about. So things like maybe becoming more sleepy. So you might notice your loved one's sleep cycles getting off, that they nap more frequently during the day. Maybe they don't sleep for that 8 hour stretch at night anymore. That's something that changes. So you may see more sleepiness during the day. You see a loss of ability to initiate things. So for maybe someone in the early stage, if they're bored, they might get up and flip on the TV or go to the kitchen to get a cup of coffee or, get up and do something. But for someone by late stage, they've lost that ability to initiate something. So they'll probably just sit in that same chair until somebody comes and moves them, or they won't initiate an activity unless someone is sitting there doing it with them, getting it going with them at least. So it's that person really relying on other people for pretty much everything.
Okay. And can dementia cause someone to have more vivid dreams at night? My mother seems to be having them and relaying them to me. I
Hmm.
checked some caregiver websites and noticed that others have reported the same about their elderly parents.
Yeah. So it may be that it's possible that because of the way the brain is changing and the way that affects our sleep, that the person is having more dreams, but it might also be that the person is having more difficulty separating the dream from the reality, or having sort of illusions about reality and thinking that it's a dream, or thinking the dream was something that really happened, or kind of all these combinations of different things. But it does become more and more difficult to separate what is reality and what was a dream. I would say that's something that happens with my own grandmother. She'll wake up, from a nap or something, and think that she saw her sister. Well, maybe she had a dream about her sister, but she thinks that she actually saw her sister. So those kinds of things definitely do happen. And if you ever attend a support group, you'll see that these things that you may not really know, is this normal or not, or should I be concerned or not? When you go to a support group, you end up talking to other people and getting more of a feeling about, what is normal, what isn't, do I need to be concerned, what can I do about it?
Okay. All right. I see a hand raised here. So since we're at the end and we're just about to finish up, I will say two things. One, that as you sign out, there'll be a brief survey, and we really appreciate your answering the survey so we know what is most helpful to you as far as presenting the webinars and the topics. And we do have several upcoming webinars in the next months. 5 questions to consider about paying for long-term care is coming in September. When your loved one is hospitalized is coming in October. And emergency preparedness for caregivers is coming in November, and you will find those things in the same place that you found information on this. So I'm going to unmute everybody now, and if you have your hand raised and you were not able to type in a question, if you would like to speak your question, you can have that opportunity now, and then I'll do that for a very brief period because I just got one final question here as well. So, okay, so I'm going to allow people to speak, and then, so if you do have a question, you can ask it in case you are not able to type your question. And while we're waiting for that, Lindsay, here's another question. Any advice for when children and spouse do not agree upon care for dementia? Lindsay?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Did you hear did you hear that last question
No,
about advice?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question?
Okay. Any advice for when children and spouse do not agree upon care for a dementia patient?
Oh, that's a hard one, and it's really really common. Um, Sometimes I think it's a matter of kind of all getting on the same page. Maybe there are some family members who are in denial, and others who see things a little bit more clearly. We as humans just have different ways that we approach problems. But educating yourself and making sure that others in the family are educated is a good first step. I would also suggest for families who are challenged in that way, consider bringing on a care manager, which is a professional who it's privately paid, but it's a person who's sort of a knowledgeable person in the field who works for the person living with dementia, who can help the family understand what's going on, help identify resources, help kind of guide the family and what are realistic options and working through pros and cons and all kinds of things like that. So for families where there's a lot of conflict, a care manager can be useful.
Okay, thank you. It says, but would the care manager be biased to the spouse paying the bills?
Hmm, Not in my experience. If you have a good care manager, I mean, they're going to look at what's in the best interest of the person living with dementia, and they'll be able to look at things from a less emotional, personal point of view. Families, we have history together, and we have baggage, we have, you know, these sort of ingrained ways that we communicate with each other. By bringing somebody else into the picture, whether it's a care manager or you come in and meet with me and just have a consultation, or somebody else, families will often listen to the expert and their recommendation, and start to put aside some of their kind of personal opinions.
Okay. And I did have somebody ask to provide the info on the November 12th seminar again.
So the conference will be it's actually the First Baptist Church in Alexandria on Monday, November 12th. And it's the registration and breakfast period begins at 8 o'clock, and the conference ends at 3:30. And there's a $35 fee to attend, and there will be an Eventbrite page where you would register online, and pay online to attend. I will let you know that there is a limited number of respite care for a person living with dementia. So if you have a loved one that that can't be left home alone, there's no one else that can help. Graceful Care, one of our consortium members, is offering respite care. So that's one of the things that'll be on the invitation, where to call for that, how to get that set up. I'll tell you that our keynote speaker is Kim Campbell, the wife of the former Glenn Campbell, the Grammy Award winning artist and country singer. And so she'll be our keynote speaker. We will have a provider from Georgetown Memory Disorder Clinic who will speak with us. We will have a social worker and also a music therapist, and a performance by a chorus. So it'll be a really great day. The breakfast, the lunch, the snacks, the materials are all included. And there's an opportunity at all of the breaks to go around and visit lots of different exhibitor tables. So you can pick up information, you can ask questions, learn about lots of different resources. So it's a really, really wonderful day. And so Insight will have that link on our website when it's ready. Lucy will put it in her newsletter, the Caregiver Corner, when the link is ready. And so the word will start getting out. There are a limited number of spaces. The conference will hold about 250 people. So I would say don't wait until the week before to register. Register early.
Yes, and it's something like the 30th year of this conference, so it's really well done and very well organized. So thank you again, Lindsay, and thank you everybody for coming to today's webinar. And we'll see you all soon at another webinar.